Welcome to the Emerging Civil War podcast. I'm Chris Mackowski, and joining me today from across the pond is Tim Galsworthy. Tim, how are you today?
I'm great, thank you, Chris. Good to be joining you.
Now, I waited until you took your drink of water before I introduced you, so of course, right? And we're talking about Tim's new book, which is fascinating to me. The Republican House Divided. Let me see if I can get in there for. Oh, there you go. It's showing up better on your screen. The Republican House Divided: Civil War Memory, Civil Rights, and the Transformation of the GOP. And Tim, the premise of the book really is how the GOP has used Civil War memories to really kind of shape its own identify as it's moved forward from the civil rights era. What got you hooked on this idea in the first place, which is fascinating to me?
Yeah, I mean, there's a long story and there's a short story. So I guess the to go back to the origins, really, I was very lucky in that, and I premise this by saying I went to a very normal, we would say state school, you would say public school, um, uh, high school, which was twinned with a school on Martha's Vineyard. No idea why. So I got to spend 2 weeks in Martha's Vineyard when I was about sort of 14, 15. So I kind of
Okay.
fell in love with all things American and then went back with my parents, went to Boston, but rather than falling in love with revolutionary history, fell in love with the Massachusetts 54th and Civil War history. And then I did some Civil War courses as an undergraduate, but then found actually it's Civil War memory. That's the bit I'm interested in. And then while I was doing my master's, Trump was elected for the first time on my birthday, which kind of felt like a sign of things. And then in between sort of masters and starting my PhD, we had Charlottesville, and just before that we had Charleston, and it felt like kind of Civil War memory was all around, and it was just taken as a given that the Republican Party was associated with Confederate memory, but that doesn't make sense in the in the long sway of American history. Why is the party of Lincoln waving the Confederate battle flag? If you consider it in those terms, it doesn't make sense. So I wanted to get to grips with it, and that's where my PhD project was born, and that's where the book was born.
And you really make a very interesting case in the book that the GOP has branded itself as the party of Lincoln and Lee,
Mm.
which seems to be cognitive dissonance for some of us. But for the
Yeah,
GOP, it's not.
no, and I think all American politicians claim Lincoln at some point, I would say. I think everyone's got to, Donald, uh, David Donald's words, get right with Lincoln, right? That's, you've got to do that. But I think what you see, what I make the case in the book that from the civil rights era, from the 1960s onwards, kind of the lost cause, tragic era narratives really creep into the Republican Party from Southern Republicans, but then they get taken on by national figures. So that you get to the stage now. Donald Trump claims Lincoln. Lots of other Republicans claim Lincoln, but at the same time, there's a defense of Confederate monuments. There's a defense of Robert E. Lee and other figures, and I think it's because it's an attempt to use memory kind of instrumentally. What are the best memories to help me in this situation? And there's not a willingness from Republicans to get rid of Lincoln, even at the same time that I think from the 60s in particular onwards, they are more readily embracing Lee and Davis and all these other Confederate icons.
Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit about that transformation as we go here. There's a really neat line you have in the second to last paragraph of your epilogue. If I could share here, you talk about the inter-party conflicts and partisan changes to the 1960s and 70s GOP helped forge the conditions enabling an insurrectionist to carry a Confederate battle flag into the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021, in support of a Republican president without any concern for historical contradiction. So, Republican support, Confederate battle flag. And so, again, this idea of these really different ideas all coming together without any sense of identity disruption, I guess.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of where I start the book with the guy, Kevin, I think it's Kevin Seafield's his name, from Delaware, carrying the Confederate battle flag into the US Capitol. That very famous image of him with the Confederate battle flag between the pictures of it's Calhoun and Sumner, isn't it? And I use that to say, as I kind of said earlier, well, let's stop and take stock. How did we get to that moment? How do you get to the moment where someone's carrying a Confederate battle flag into the US Capitol to support a Republican president? And I effectively pitched the book as, well, I'm trying to explain how we got here. What are the short term and longer term processes that enable this confluence of memory to come together. Now, underlying it all is the fact that most politicians do not think, the memories they engage with, they're not that deep. We'll see lots this year, lots of references to 1776, lots of references to the Declaration of Independence that are very surface level. It's the same thing that Martin Luther King had a dream one day, and that's effectively all politicians will ever say about Martin Luther King is that he had a dream. So it's again, what are the most useful instrumental values in that moment for a politician to use to appeal to who they're appealing to? But yeah, fundamentally, the hook, as it were, that I kind of kick the book off with, that I kick off all my public talks with, is that image of the guy with the Confederate battle flag in the US Capitol and just stopping and going, almost like the record scratch. That's me wondering how I got here. That's effectively what I'm trying to do with the book.
So I thought it was a really great frame because it is like one of those jarring juxtapositions. So let's start with what is the Party of Lincoln? What does the
Mm.
Party of Lincoln look like prior to the Civil Rights Movement? And maybe kind of use that as our foundational definition to work from.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of the Republican Party itself, I broadly share E. James Reichley's kind of separation of the GOP into different groups, and he has kind of progressives, moderates, stalwarts, and conservatives, and he sees kind of, or he says liberals. I use progressives instead for the kind of most left group, ranging from the liberal to conservative. The majority of the party are kind of moderates, kind of Eisenhower style figures, or stalwarts, slightly more conservative, more Taft-like figures. And then outside of that, you have kind of more left like Rockefeller, more right like Goldwater. So the party is has got these different factions going on. The 50s, you've very much seen kind of the triumph of the moderates with Eisenhower, the triumph of the moderates over the stalwarts. So that's kind of where the party is. And I think in the 60s and 70s, as I lay out in the book, there is a real battle going on, particularly between kind of progressives and moderates and the more conservative wing of the party. That's kind of the story that's going on politically alongside the Civil War memory in the book. In terms of kind of the Party of Lincoln as it comes to Civil War memory, from 1865 onwards, Republicans have celebrated Lincoln. Throughout the 19th century, they waved the bloody shirt, as it were, to try and get Union veterans in particular to the polls. But the Civil War has meant different things to different Republicans throughout the period. During the New Deal, Lincoln is held up by FDR as the symbol of big government intervention, while at the same time being used by Alf Landon and conservative Republicans as being an opponent of big government because he's this frontier hero. Eisenhower has a particular relationship with Lincoln and kind of leadership, although he also talks about how he likes Lincoln and he likes Lee, and there's kind of the military man element to it. So what I would say is almost all Republicans claim Lincoln to fit their purposes, whatever they may be. But also he's become this national figure. Kennedy spends a lot of time talking about Lincoln. LBJ spends a lot of time talking about Lincoln. But the party of Lincoln itself, it's diffuse, it's broadly centre right coming into the 1960s. There's a broad kind of unity around broadly being pro-capitalist and anti-big government. But what you see breaking out in the 60s is a real intra-party battle over what's the direction of the party going to be over civil rights, where effectively it's kind of been bumbling along on civil rights ever since. Ever since the end of the Lodge Bill, and then kind of civil rights disappears from the political agenda, even if it's still there for black activists.
Right. Now, you mentioned Eisenhower a minute ago, and of course, he
Mm,
uses the Civil War in a pretty unique way compared to other
mm,
presidents because he lives on the battlefield. He
yeah,
had been stationed on the battlefield. He liked to take dignitaries across the battlefield. And that's a
yeah.
much different use of the Civil War and a much more tangible use of the Civil War than I think other presidents and politicians have used it.
Yeah, and this is actually part of kind of one of my next projects is looking a bit at Eisenhower. And Eisenhower has a really interesting relationship with the Civil War. As you say, I think it's the only house him and Mamie ever buy is at Gettysburg, the Gettysburg farm, where he breeds award-winning cattle. But anyway, that's sort of random aside. Um, Of genuinely award-winning cattle.
Yeah, yeah.
He he uses a lot of Lincoln. He has this particular he likes the fragment on government from Lincoln about the idea that everyone should do what they can for themselves, and only when they can't do it is when government comes in. So he uses that a lot to frame his identity. But what I think people underestimate how comfortable Eisenhower actually is with elements of the Lost Cause. Now he's
Mhm.
very friendly with Douglas Southall Freeman, biographer of Robert E. Lee. There's lots of examples where he's very what we might call reconciliationist. So he presents Lincoln and Lee as kind of in the same league, alongside one another. He sends, I think it's 1959. It's the last Confederate veteran, which obviously he isn't because it's 1959. But he's willing to play some of these lost cause games. But yeah, I think Eisenhower, more than any figure before him, taps into kind of maybe a military memory of the Civil War in the way that just isn't open to other presidents because he is fundamentally a military man that becomes president rather than having this alternative political career.
And then your book really kind of looks at the presidential elections through the civil rights era, and each
Yeah.
chapter kind of focuses on how this election transforms the landscape, and it really kind of traces out that tug of war between these different elements of the party. And I think a lot of people today don't realize that
Mm.
the Republican Party and the Democratic Party were both pretty broad in spectrum as far as their makeup. Today we sort of think about the Republicans as conservatives, the Democrats as liberals, and there are gradients to each of those. But both of these parties had wide spectrums of background.
Absolutely, and I think I make the case that this is a moment where some of that kind of it's called kind of sorting within political science, where some of this partisan sorting starts to happen. Isn't final, there are conservative, particularly Southern Democrats, well into the 1990s, sometimes into the 21st century. But what you do see, I mean, I think some of the elections in this period, I particularly think 1964 is this really important pivot moment where the GOP effectively decides it's going to go to the right. Um, of various gradients. The conservatism of Goldwater versus Nixon versus Ford versus Reagan is very different, but they have fundamentally made the decision that, well, we are going to go to the right. We are going to call it the white South. But as you say, I spent a lot of time in the early chapters when I'm talking about these emerging Southern Republicans. They're up against very racially conservative, segregationist, white supremacist Democrats in the South. That's who they're fighting. And there are these in a way that, as you say, there just isn't now kind of regional and particularly ideological diversity within both parties that I just don't think we see these days. But I do think that the 60s, the 70s, the hardening of those divisions related very much to civil rights is absolutely central to the story I'm trying to tell of the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it was fascinating because, of course, in the South, for 100 years, the Republicans are the carpetbaggers and
Yeah.
scallywags, and
Yeah.
then suddenly they're not. Briefly outline for us, kind of what you saw the Southern perspective of the GOP being before these really important series of elections begin.
What I think, there is a Republican Party in the South. It's very much there in Reconstruction. The first attempt at interracial democracy in the South. But then, effectively, once Reconstruction is de facto and de jure over, the Republican Party remains in the South, but it very much it's sometimes referred to as kind of a phone box Republican Party because there's so few people. But it's very important in terms of conventions. So there's been some great work done by Jeff Jenkins and Boris Hersink about how different party leaders try to use the Southern delegations to get nominations. Eisenhower himself, getting the nomination is due to some contested Southern delegations. So there's that side of it that they are, they still have votes at conventions, even if a Republican is never going to win a statewide race, they can win. There is still important delegates and patronage. If you get Republicans in government, then, well, Republicans in Alabama, Mississippi, South Carolina, they're going to put their hands up and say, well, we want our share of the federal pie. So it exists very much in those terms. There are these small pockets of republicanism that should be stressed, particularly aligned with areas of unionism. So areas like East Tennessee, the mountains of Alabama, there are East Texas, there are some of these pockets of unionism that from the Civil War era that very much correlate with republicanism. And you do see the New Deal does kick off some republicanism in opposition to the kind of big government elements of the FDR years, but it is very much the starting in the 50s and then very much in the 60s that Republicans become competitive in the South. Some of that's because Eisenhower institutes something called Operation Dixie, kind of very institutional, bureaucratic, to build up the parties in the South, but also civil rights. You have Brown, you have Little Rock, you have these flashpoints of the civil rights era that mean anger about civil rights and is an attempt from Southern Republicans to flank the Democrats on race, particularly in the Deep South.
Yeah. And how does race play into the GOP's identity prior to the real launch of the civil rights movement?
Depends on where you're looking, really. Like there is absolutely a strong Black Republican tradition. You know, absolutely there is the realignment in the 1930s. 32, particularly 34. Of African Americans in the North that can vote, turning to the Democrats for economic reasons. The idea of, well, we'll go with the New Deal, but there remains a Black Republican tradition who, so they're very much pushing for civil rights within the party. Um, there's a spectrum of opinion. Broadly, most Republicans would see themselves as in favor of civil rights, but it's very moderate, guarded civil rights. I think the Republican approach to civil rights is embodied by the 1957, 1960 Civil Rights Act. You know, they're landmark, they have elements to them, but they're not that robust. There's no real meat behind them. And I think there absolutely are progressive Republicans who want the GOP to go further on civil rights. But effectively, from the defeat of the Lodge Bill and the federal elections bill in the 1890s, civil rights is relegated as an issue by most Republicans. They care more about tax, defense, government. That's the priorities. Race is lower down the pecking order. And it's from sort of 1948. Well, it starts a bit with FDR, but very much 1948 when you get the plank at the Democrats convention, which leads to the Dixiecrat revolt. Very much civil rights becomes a Democrat issue, either liberal Democrats in the North pushing it, conservative Democrats in the South opposing it. It's in the 60s, I would argue, that more Republicans realize they can make race an issue because race has become a bigger issue
Yeah.
in American politics, thanks to Black activists.
Yeah. So, is there a moment within the civil rights movement that you might look at and say, this is really kind of the tipping point where it has ripples on the landscape of the parties?
I mean, I think not wanting to conform. I mean, I do kind of conform a little bit to the kind of Montgomery to Memphis narrative at times. I do think you have to look at 61, 62, 63, 64. You have to look at things like the clash at Alabama with George Wallace, where Kennedy in June 1963 ultimately decides, I'm going to have to do a forceful civil rights bill. He's kind of been tentative on civil rights, but actually he's going to have to do a serious civil rights bill. I think that is a key moment because if Kennedy, the statistics shows that most African Americans would have picked Kennedy in a race with Goldwater, but after that they would have picked him in a race with Rockefeller as well. So that kind of progressive pro civil rights wing of the GOP, the tanks are parked on its lawn. Right, it makes it really hard for progressive Republicans to say, well, if we're pro civil rights, we'll get African Americans and racial liberals. From when Kennedy's making more kind of ardent moves towards civil rights, that becomes much harder. But I also think need to look at the 64 Civil Rights Act as well. In reality, the 64 Civil Rights Act doesn't pass without Republicans. It doesn't pass without Everett Dirksen in the Senate getting the filibuster closed, bringing in cloture. It doesn't pass without him getting Republicans through the Senate votes. But Goldwater votes against it. Only six Republicans vote against the Civil Rights Act, the 64 Civil Rights Act in the Senate. Goldwater is one of them, and he ends up being the nominee. So fairly or unfairly, the Republican Party gets branded as the anti-civil rights party from that moment onwards. Okay. And it has never really recovered. Goldwater gets 6% of the black vote. Yes, a Republican will probably get more than 6%, but you're not getting anywhere near the sort of 25, 30, 35, 40 that did happen under Eisenhower and earlier. So I think Kennedy very much allying the Democratic Party firmly with civil rights in 63 and the 64 Civil Rights Act. I think those are two particular moments I would pick out.
So in that little window of time, then I kind of always go back to LBJ and his ultimate support as a
Yep.
conservative Southern Democrat, basically going against what he knows is his own self-interest, and he says
Mhm.
like, we've lost the South for a generation because of
Yeah.
this. Tell me about his role in that because it does have a reverberation on the Republican side afterwards, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, I think LBJ, like Kennedy, realizes the way the wind's blowing, and I have a lot of time for LBJ. I think he effectively waters down the 57 and 60 Civil Rights Act as Senate leaders. I do subscribe to the view that he gets more liberal the further up the food chain he gets. The more, going from the further up kind of the political food chain he goes, he moves slightly more to the left, and I think he realizes that. I don't think he ever wants to lose the South. He holds Texas and other southern states. The border South stays Democrat in 64 because they see Goldwater as so extreme, and you haven't quite got into the era of Black Power and the Long Hot Summer or anything like that yet. Holds Texas in 1968 as well. So I don't think LBJ ever wants to get rid of the South, but I do think he, like Kennedy, like other Democrats, have read the writing on the wall and gone, well, actually, if we give them the credit, they want to meet the moment and say, well, we need to show leadership on civil rights, probably for a Cold War context. They don't want the Soviets
Oh
to be
yeah.
able to point to America and go, look at what they do, particularly to kind of new free nations in Asia and Africa, and saying, look what they do to people of color. But politically as well, it's a way of bringing, solidly tying African Americans to the Democratic Party, way of tying racial liberals to the party. That firm, that New Deal coalition holds strong. But yes, they absolutely, the LBJ quip about I've lost the South for a generation. Well, there's some degree of truth to that. No, no, the only Democrat, if you take out Georgia in 2020 and Virginia's are slightly it's more kind of moving to the Democrats, or it's slightly different. The only Democrat presidential nominees that have won substantial Southern votes have been Southerners in Carter and Clinton. So I do
Right.
think we have to see after 64 something changes.
Yeah, yeah. I gotta it's so exciting to see your excitement for this topic, by the way. I just love your enthusiasm.
I can't be quiet. The talking with my hands is something I do when I'm teaching or talking about the book or anything.
We're talking with Tim Galsworthy about his book, The Republican House Divided. We've mentioned Barry Goldwater a couple times, but
Yeah.
for folks who aren't familiar with Goldwater, arguably one of the most influential politicians who didn't become president in the second half of the century. Give us your thumbnail sketch of Goldwater and how he fits into this.
So Goldwater is from Arizona, small business owner, quite wealthy. Comes into the Senate. He's a very conservative Republican in terms of his anti-union, pro-states' rights, anti-big government. That's his big thing. Now he is very much the shining light. He's the celebrated figure of the Republican right from when he kind of emerges fully on the political scene in the 1950s. There's a book kind of with his name on, but it's ghostwritten by his brother-in-law called The Conscience of a Conservative, which comes out in 1960. And this kind of becomes the Bible, becomes the touchstone for Republican conservatives. And there's very much this sense of, well, we've had enough of kind of Eisenhower Me Too republicanism, the idea that all these moderate Republicans do is ape the Democrats, and they're just liberal as well. So we need a true conservative. That's the way we can win. Some people make that case in 1960. Nixon kind of sees that off, but that only kind of feeds into this feeling of from his reporters. Well, we're having the party stolen from us. So from 1961 onwards, a group called the Chicago Group. They organize at the grassroots and they basically take over the GOP from the bottom up. They fill state level structures with Goldwater supporters, which means when it comes to 64, he's got the nomination sewn up. He wins it comfortably. And it is very much this moment of absolute elation for the Republican right. They've got a true ideologue, a true ideological conservative as the nominee. And obviously, it's the great despair for progressive and moderate Republicans. He loses in 64, but he's so influential because he energizes his Republican right. He brings white Southerners into the Republican Party. He wins five deep South states. He wins 87% of the vote in Mississippi, right? That's not to that's no small matter. Even with even with it's a segregated electorate, 87% of the vote goes for a Republican in Mississippi. That's a landmark moment. And I see him as this figure that drags the GOP to the right because after him, Nixon absolutely is not a Goldwaterite. Doesn't go as far as him as, voting against civil rights acts or being so stridently conservative. But he realized he can tap that conservatism. If he can moderate it, if he can kind of dull the rough edges, he can win. And that's where you get law and order. That's where you get kind of Nixon's silent majority. It's realizing that you can't be as out there as Goldwater, but you can get some of those same votes if you talk about busing, if you talk about tax, if you talk about taxpayers. It's all that coded language. I mean, there's a great I can't remember who it is, but a Republican strategist said that Goldwater won in 64. It just took 16 years to count the votes. Yeah, that invisible bridge that Rick Perlstein's talked about, that from Goldwater to go to Reagan. I don't think it's that simple, but I do think Goldwater as that kind of ideological touchstone is so important for moving the GOP to the right.
And as far as Civil War memory, I mean, you talk about how, like, people in the West just don't have that connection the way people in the East and certainly people in the South do. How does Goldwater use Civil War memory as part of his campaign or not use it, as the case might?
I mean, of course, Civil War historians listening, I know the Civil War happened in the West, and I know there is a Western Civil War memory. Kevin Waite, he's written great work on the Civil War in the West, Civil War memory in California. So I don't want to say it's not there, but it is different. Arizona is not a state when the Civil War happens, right? He makes great play when he's in the early 60s trying to win over white Southerners a bit more, of referring to Arizona as Confederate territory, which is not, it's a little bit lazy, but it's a way of winning white Southern support. So on the one hand, Goldwater and his supporters, especially, actually, really try to draw links with Lincoln. So in 1960, when there's this kind of incipient campaign to try and get him either the vice presidency or picked instead of Nixon for the top job, they released this booklet that has quotes from Lincoln and quotes from Conscience of a Conservative to try and show that the two of them are kind of identical. And he does present, he often says, well, Lincoln's a conservative and I'm a conservative. Again, that speaks to that very plastic memory of Lincoln. But he gets very much associated. His supporters are not always using the Lincolnian memory. There's lots of examples in the book of his supporters waving Confederate battle flags. At one rally in early 1964, he's met by people in reenacting garb with a Civil War era cannon. So they go full in on this idea that the kind of Confederate memory. And I make the case in the book that it's because that Confederate memory, that pro-Confederate memory, has been so associated with white supremacist, segregationist, democratic politics that when they see Goldwater as the figure that can best defend that, well, then they transpose the memory over to them. The people who've been waving Confederate battle flags for George Wallace and Ross Barnett, well, it makes sense to wave them for Goldwater too. That will be my claim. But he very much does not see himself as being against Lincoln. But he again is part of that moment where you can have Lincoln and Lee at the same time, fitting comfortably together in a racially conservative Republican Party.
Yeah. And then let me go back to the term you used a second ago, the plasticity of
Yeah.
Lincoln. Let me have it. You use that in the book a couple
Mm.
times, and I love that term. Why don't you, for our listeners, sort of define what you mean by the plasticity of Lincoln?
I guess another way of saying that is malleable. I would make the case that every Republican wants to get right with Lincoln. Every Republican, almost every politician, list any major politician in the United States in the last 100 years, they'll probably quote Lincoln at some point or claim Lincoln at some point. Reagan, I think, famously made up, it was fake Lincoln quotes, wasn't it? At the 92 Republican convention, someone put them in and they weren't actual Lincoln quotes. But anyway, what I mean by that is Lincoln is all things to all people. So for conservative Republicans, he is anti-big government. He's the frontier man. He's the rail splitter, individualism and hard work. But then for progressive Republicans, particularly black progressives, he's the emancipator. But then also for some black Republicans, they say after 64 in particular, well, let's stop talking about Lincoln. Like, if we just shout Lincoln, we're not going to get people to vote for us. So
Right.
there is some criticality, particularly from black progressives. But for those who really want to push a pro-civil rights GOP, Lincoln, emancipation, that's very useful memory, right? Throughout 64, Goldwater's opponents, Nelson Rockefeller, William Scranton, and others, basically make the case, well, he's an aberration, he's a disgrace of Lincoln. If we're truly Lincoln's party, we've got to be pro-civil rights. So that's what I mean by plasticity,
Yeah.
malleability. Lincoln is all things to all people, because he's just so gigantic in American history.
Yeah.
I would argue he looms larger than Washington, really. So everyone wants to, in some way, grab his coattails.
Yeah, I feel like Lincoln and Thomas Jefferson has that sort of
Yeah.
persona where you can get a quote from Lincoln or Jefferson to prove any point you want because, he's so
Like I think
useful that way.
it's the fact that it's this is from other scholars who've written about Lincoln memory is that in the 1930s you have segregationists claiming Lincoln. Some of his language
Oh,
about
yeah.
black voting, some of the things he says in the 58 Senate race, which it's racist by any standard. But at the same time, he's being claimed by communists because he talks about labor and capital. Like
Right.
that's the Communist Party, the CPUSA or USACP. I always get confused which way around they are. They have big banners of Lincoln and Jefferson at their conventions. So that's what I mean. He can be claimed by segregationists and socialists in the same breath.
Yeah. And you talk about how Nixon
Mm.
uses Lincoln particularly as a way for him to
Mm.
navigate Civil War memory. And Nixon's a pretty slippery eel when it comes to kind of how he moves through this era in his own political identity. And he's the follow-up to Goldwater. You mentioned him
Yeah.
just a few minutes ago. Pick that up for us. How does kind of Lincoln slip in, or Nixon slip into this?
I mean, I think I make the case in the book that you can kind of trace Nixon's changing kind of political persona through his relationship with Lincoln. So in 1960, Nixon is effectively running as a moderate. He's running as a centrist. He's running as kind of the continuity candidate with Eisenhower. In the Eisenhower administration, Nixon is seen as the civil rights advocate. He's the NAACP life member. Like that, he is the civil rights voice within Eisenhower's White House to some extent, alongside others. So in 1960, he runs very much as a moderate. He uses Lincoln more than anything else to talk about the Cold War. Him and Kennedy have almost interchangeable language about the world. Nixon, Lincoln had half slave, half free. Today, the world is half slave, half free. You can imagine how that fits. Then after he loses in 60 narrowly, thanks to, well, if you're a conspiracy theorist, because of people in Illinois and Texas and dodgy, but there were some Republican shenanigans in 60 as well. It's why they didn't contest it. But anyway, after 64, he spies an opportunity to kind of return to leadership. Okay. And he realizes that he needs to kind of pitch himself now as a center right, a leaning to the right, to try and pick up some of that Goldwater vote. So Lincoln goes from being used for kind of moderate civil rights advocacy, Cold War rhetoric, to being about law and order. Now he uses quotes particularly from Lincoln's Lyceum address about respect for law and order. So that very much becomes part of Nixon's pitch that against civil rights radicals, against university radicals, against the anti-war movement. I'm for law and order. Lincoln was for law and order, so vote for me. But then when you get into the presidency, it shifts a little bit more as well. Lincoln is still there. He's using Lincoln to defend himself during Watergate. That's how far it goes. But also he and other people in his administration pick up the lost cause. I would say they pick up the pro-Confederate memories that until then had primarily been used by Southern Republicans themselves. Nixon, he goes to West Point and says, "Well, why don't you have a statue honoring Confederates?" And then he gives speeches talking about the South rising again in the Republican Party. So Nixon is, I think, underappreciated for how canny a politician he was.
Yeah.
He's down and out twice in 60 and 62, and then he's wins two presidential elections. And I think Civil War memory has been underappreciated about. I don't think Nixon particularly cares about the Civil War. Supposedly, he used to tell his university classmates that his family were the Underground Railroad, and supposedly he used to devour all these books about Lincoln. I think, as with all things, if communism had been popular in the United States, Nixon would have been a communist. So I think he sees Civil War memory as a way to kind of to put across whatever view he needs to put across at that moment, whatever he thinks. You know, he is brilliant at reading the political winds, and he uses Civil War memory to support whatever point he's trying to make at that time.
He's remarkably opportunistic in an
Oh,
effective way for him, right?
in a brilliant way, in a conniving kind of evil way, but also in a brilliant way at the same time.
Yeah, yeah. There is that famous scene from the movie about Nixon that Oliver Stone did. So, so we'll take it
Yeah,
with a
yeah.
grain of salt. But where Nixon's out in the middle of the night and he's at the Lincoln Memorial, and
Yes.
that is grounded in reality. Did
Yes.
did did Nixon have that kind of relationship with Lincoln? I mean, is that his muse?
It's hard to tell, right? I'm not sure I'd want to go inside Richard Nixon's brain, even if I could. I think he sees, I think it's for him and for almost other politicians, like I said before, Lincoln is the GOAT, right? Lincoln is the model American. He's displaced Washington. It's him and then maybe Jefferson and then maybe Washington, but Lincoln is kind of away on his own as the greatest American,
Yeah.
right? So he and his team see the advantage of playing on Lincoln. I do think he thought about Lincoln a bit. He talks about Lincoln throughout his career. As I said, he likes that. One of his college professors said he had a better than routine knowledge of Lincoln. I don't think he felt a connection as much as other Republicans necessarily, but I think he certainly saw Lincoln as useful. But on that particular event you mentioned, Nixon going to the Lincoln Memorial, that happens in May 1970 in the midst of major anti-war protests because of the escalation of the war into Cambodia. Um, I start my last chapter before the epilogue with that because on the morning that Nixon does that, he stands in the shadow of Lincoln. His vice president Spiro Agnew goes down to Stone Mountain, Georgia, and stands in the shadow of the world's biggest Confederate monument beneath stone reliefs of Davis, Robert E. Lee, and Thomas Stonewall Jackson. So very poetically for me, I can say that the Republican president and Republican vice president are literally standing in the shadows of Lincoln and Lee on the same day. And if
Yeah.
that doesn't capture the change in the party by 1970, it just perfectly encapsulates it, I think.
Yeah. Now, I don't think you realize this, but ECW listeners know I'm a big Stonewall Jackson fan. And let the record show we're 38 minutes into the conversation, and Tim, not me, is the one who brought up Stonewall Jackson. I just want the record to reflect that. Um,
He's not in the book that much, I'm afraid. He only gets a couple of references.
that's all right. And that's an extraordinary moment, though, that you mentioned, because of that juxtaposition between those two monuments. And the GOP has gone through a pretty remarkable transformation by that point in the book.
Yeah.
Tell me, like, what's happening to the GOP in the South as part of Nixon's Southern strategy and this metamorphosis that it's undergoing?
I think what's really interesting is it's not as simple a picture as you might expect. Now, on the one hand, post 1965, the South is integrated politically. Okay, so many Southern Republicans realize we can't be out there segregationists because we're not going to win. Right, so some Southern Republicans start to moderate their language a bit, and it becomes very much when they refer to the Civil War, they refer to Reconstruction, but only as a foil to sort of say we need to move on. That's in the past. The Civil War and Reconstruction, carpetbaggers, scalawags, that's all in the past. We need to move on. But there do remain more racially conservative Republicans who are more willing to play on white sensitivities, who were more willing to wave Confederate battle flags. I'll get and other elements of kind of outwardly pro-Confederate memory. But one example, there's a guy who pops up throughout the book called Albert Watson, very conservative Republican in South Carolina. He runs for governor in 1970, and there's this moment where he effectively causes a riot in a place called Lamar by telling parents that they don't have to obey the law and integrate schools. And other Republicans distance themselves from him. And in the wake of this, he's going to a few rallies, and at one, a band plays Dixie. And he goes, well, I love Dixie, and I'll be called a racist for that, but play it anyway. And he keeps using this at lots of rallies. So you've got kind of both going on. Most Republicans are relatively, they're racially conservative, but in quite a coded way. They're not talking about segregation, they're talking about busing, right? Because they realize you can't be openly segregationist, they're going to have to get some black votes. But there does remain this more kind of strident conservative, kind of outwardly conservative, racially conservative strain who are more willing to employ Confederate battle flags, Dixie, all that kind of gubbins. But I think as well, it's important to say that, and this is a point other scholars have made, the realignment happens on a presidential level quicker than on the lower level. It's not until the 21st century, really, where again, excluding Virginia, the South is almost uniformly Republican at state and local level. That doesn't happen immediately. The kind of voting for Goldwater, voting for Nixon, voting for Reagan, that comes ahead of some of the state level stuff. That does take longer because some Southern Democrats are able to thread the needle, or there is that just unwillingness to totally switch. There's more ticket splitting than we would see today.
Is there a point where the GOP sort of embraces this new identity and feels comfortable about it? Because you've sort of talked about like the coded language, and we can't quite be openly, but like, do they get more comfortable about that?
I would have said it's hard to say, right? Because I think in some ways, coded coded racial conservatism becomes the norm, right? We Willie Horton advert with George Herbert Walker Bush, right? Things like that. And I don't think anyone, Texas politician, I don't think anyone would accuse George Bush of being in the same kind of race baiting category of someone like Goldwater or Nixon, even. I certainly wouldn't. So it does very much become the norm. I would argue that actually in the 21st century, we've seen race become more explicitly part of American politics generally than perhaps it had been. Race had kind of been, it's been coded, it's been under the surface, it's always there. I would argue American politics is almost always about race and place and the government effectively is what it's always about. But I think by the time you get into the 70s, you get into kind of Ford, you get into these moments, the Republican Party is established to some extent in the South. There's less need to be so outwardly talking about Reconstruction, to be talking about the Civil War, to be waving Confederate battle flags, because you're not butting up against 100 years of tradition anymore. People have voted Republican. It's the ripping off the band-aid. When you do something for the first time, it's much easier the second time, particularly when it comes to voting. If you voted for one party your whole life, it's a wretch to vote for the other one. But once you do it once, it becomes a little bit easier.
Yeah, yeah. And you mentioned in the book how this was not an inevitable transformation. Like
No.
it could have gone a different way.
Yeah.
Is there a tipping point moment where there's a point of no return?
I mean, 64 is always really important, but
Yeah.
I think more than anything, I think the mistake kind of the anti-Goldwater forces, so progressives and moderates, made in the early 1960s is they underestimated the Goldwater threat operationally. And by that I mean they talk, Rockefeller and his allies spend lots of the 1960s saying we need to be a pro-civil rights party. Goldwater is everything we're not, but they don't do the work at the grassroots. They don't set up a rival to the Chicago group to fill the Republican Party with Rockefeller supporters or Scranton supporters or Lodge supporters to get the nomination away from Goldwater. They fail at political organizing. Because they're trying to make appeals to the nation while Goldwater rights are busy stacking the meetings to make sure they win. They're counting votes, and
Right.
that's ultimately the way you win. So I do think that early 60s, if Rockefeller wins or Scranton wins in 64, I think the story is fundamentally different. It
Mhm.
is clearly different. I'm a historian. I like to talk about what's happened. I don't like hypotheticals because, I've stopped making election predictions for the UK or the US because they're nearly always wrong. Um, um, but I do think that's a moment, right? I think
Mhm.
that's a moment where from 64 onwards, to some extent, for segments of the American population, the Republican Party is tarred with the brush of being against civil rights, and that
Yeah.
that that doesn't really go away. And if someone else had won in 64, or maybe if someone else had won instead of Nixon, there's an opportunity for a different path. But operationally within the party, those who were opposed to the right would shift. are just not effective at getting their votes over the line. They're not effective at getting enough people in the room to make a political difference.
And I saw that come out in your book a couple ways. It made me kind of think of modern politics or more modern politics in that, you know, you've got an organizational capability that maybe is not very sexy, but super efficient because it puts people in the room, as you say.
Mhm.
But then it pairs up with some of the Civil War memory stuff that's very emotional. The idea is to
Yeah.
kind of build on the emotional reactions, but then you've got an organizational machine in place that can translate that into actual results.
I think that's a very good observation, and I think that's where I'd say about Civil War memory. I am absolutely not saying Barry Goldwater won the Republican nomination in '64 because of Civil War memory. I'm not saying Nixon won in '68 and '72 because of Civil War memory. I would not make that bolder claim. But I think, as you're saying, historical memory, whatever you're talking about, is inherently emotional because you're talking about lived, or in this case, kind of shared collective memories of key moments. And I think I see politicians and political activists and ordinary Americans as well using civil war memory to tap into sentiments. It's to confirm what you were already thinking. If you're in the early 1960s and you're in the South and you're angry about Kennedy and you're angry about the integration of the University of Mississippi, and you want to do something about it, you're probably going to vote the other way anyway. But the Civil War memory helps confirm that on an emotional level, not just a rational, I'm voting for my interest level. Because people don't always vote for their interest. People don't always vote with their head, they vote with their gut and their heart. And Civil War memory plays on that gut, it plays on that heart, particularly for groups like white Southerners, particularly for groups like African Americans. It's not just a thought thing, it's a lived and felt thing.
Yeah, and I think that you make that great point sort of at the end of the book where, this transformation in the GOP has been studied. This aspect of it has not been studied, and so I think that's where your book really kind of adds this really, I think, very fascinating and emotional dimension to this transformation. Because yeah, certainly there are these, logistics that are involved in the machine, the political machines involved, but there's this felt experience that you really kind of touch on.
That's what Robert Penn Warren, writing about the Civil War centennial, he calls the Civil War America's felt history. Kind of it's in the bones and it's everywhere. And yeah, there's been an awful lot of studies of modern republicanism. There's been a lot of the Civil War memory is very much a burgeoning field at the moment, but I don't think anyone's fully brought the two together. I know there's always lots of comments about, oh well, there was a Confederate flag at this rally, or this Strom Thurmond, when he switched parties in '64 to support Goldwater, talked about the party of our fathers is dead. And I just thought these are more than anecdotal observations. These are at the core of these partisan realignments, of these social, cultural, and political shifts that are going on. So I hope I've kind of brought these two fields together and showed that actually Civil War memory generally, it's not superfluous. It's part of the story. I mean, think more contemporary. That Barack Obama was not actually didn't talk about the Civil War as much as people think, but the kind of the emotion of talking about emancipation and the emotion of talking about Lincoln keyed into the point session he was trying to subtly make around electing him president. It's still pertinent today. If Civil War memory, if memory didn't matter, people wouldn't get bothered about flags and monuments, but they do.
That's a great point. That's a great point. So as we wrap up here, invite people to read your book, The Republican House Divided. As folks go to your book, anything in particular you're hoping that they will carry away from with it?
I guess that not to make it too presentist, I think there's a danger of we all like to pitch our books and saying this helps us understand now. Although I must say, when I was writing the epilogue and the introduction, I did sometimes have to go, can everyone calm down?
Yeah.
When Nikki Haley said slavery wasn't the cause of the Civil War, I'm like, I'm trying to finish the book. I'm not trying to add another chapter. But I do think if again, sometimes I think maybe in the UK, maybe people almost kind of assume, well, where did Trump come from? Where did this a moment of American politics of hyper partisanship and hyper polarization and Trump and MAGA and all this stuff? And Confederate monuments and Charlottesville, and where did all this come from? And I hope some people take from the book, well, it didn't emerge in a vacuum, and this is part of a longer process. I hope they take lots of other stuff from it as well. I think I make a case about I very much see kind of that the kind of internal politics of the GOP hasn't been studied enough. I think some of these key figures, I think I give new insights into Rockefeller, Nixon, Goldwater. I think I really give an insight into how the Republican Party uses the memory of emancipation um, to advocate for civil rights. But I think if there's one headline takeaway, it's to return to the start of the book, because I'm on message. How do we get to the moment when the guy's got the Confederate battle flag to support a Republican president?
Yeah.
How do you get there? Because if you'd said that to someone in 1865, it would have made no sense. So
Right.
how did we get there in 2021, 2026, where that is the moment?
Yeah. I'd also like to just point out too, on your behalf, it's a book about partisanship that is done in a very nonpartisan way. I
I
really
agree.
like your objectivity. The fact that you're, coming from the UK to write this, also gives you obviously an outside perspective. And I think that's really helpful in tracing something that could otherwise really trigger a lot of strong emotions among people. But yeah, I think you do a really nice job.
I appreciate that because I don't think historians necessarily have to hide their politics. We're human beings, we all have opinions on things, but I certainly have opinions on some of the figures that are in my book. But I appreciate that you think I've been even-handed because I don't want it to be dismissed as, you know, socialist hackery,
Yeah.
and nor at the same time do I want it to be kind of decried as, oh well, this is just defense of the Republican Party. It's not. It's very clearly neither of those. It's a objective look. So no, it's good to know that it's objective because I always worried that that I'd made it obvious who the heroes and villains were. But it's good to know that my heroes and villains are implicit, not explicit.
And that is true. I enjoyed the book a great deal, and I wish you the best of luck with it.
No, that's fantastic. Thank you so much. I'm glad you enjoyed it. A few people have started reading it, I think, and seem to be enjoying it. And it's great to finally talk about it. I've worked on it for so long, and to see it actually, hold it in my hand is an amazing thing. And to chat about it with you has been fantastic as well.
The pleasure has been mine, Tim. Thanks very much for being with us.
Great
So,
stuff, Chris. Thank you.
I'm Chris Mackowski for the Emerging Civil War podcast. We'll see you online and on the battlefield.